Well, good morning. It's good to be back with you for Bible study again today. My name is Kevin Young. So grateful to be here with you. Christ Table is the name of the ministry. And I'm grateful that you're here with us this morning. If you would like to know more about this Bible study that we're doing over the next few weeks, you can visit that URL that is right there, www. Actually, it's not www at all, is it? It is go.christstable.today. And just put that slash in there, and then ancient paths. And what that's going to do is that's going to bring up a page that's going to have a PDF with all of the readings through this 6 weeks of Bible study. And you can also download as well the entire booklet that goes along with this. There's questions in here that you can utilize on your own as you go through this Bible study with us. You can use it around your table. There's some reflection places in there as well for you to journal. And so really it's just a resource for you. It's absolutely free right there at go.christstable.today/ancient paths. And also, if you would like a physical copy of this book, and then we're also doing a small group online as well that's working through Bob Goff, Love Does. You can, on that page right there, get the box. And there's a button right there at the top. Just say, get the box. And then we'll send you one for free, or we would appreciate it if you made a donation to us, and we'll get that out in the mail to you immediately. Either way, where we are going this week in these ancient paths is to look at the ancient practice of prayer. The traditional name for this season of prayer practice in the church is called the Liturgy of the Hours. And essentially what that is, if you've ever heard of that, is a fixed, regular time of prayer every day. And what we kind of talked about yesterday is that the early church, if you look closely in the book of Acts, practiced a set, fixed times during the day where they prayed. Now, today, you can actually still experience this. If you were to go to a monastery, if you were to go to a convent, this happens actually a lot in Catholic circles. And I think that maybe Protestants have lost a lot by losing this rhythm of prayer. And so actually there are 7 usually times of prayer. If you were to go to a monastery or something, they would be praying at these times. They'd be praying at midnight. They'd be praying at sunrise. They'd be praying mid-morning. They'd be praying around noon. They'd be praying again in the afternoon and in the evening at sunset and then vespers. And so it creates this rhythm of prayer that essentially becomes prayer without ceasing. You may have heard Paul write that in the New Testament, or may have even heard somebody say that. That's essentially kind of what the idea is that it becomes prayer without ceasing. So this isn't just something that is recent that the Catholic Church or more liturgical traditions have come up with. As we walked through yesterday on the first day of the study in the book of Acts, we actually see this rhythm of prayer with Peter and John and Paul and Silas, but it was a continuation, as far as we understand it, of a very older practice out of Judaism. So much of what the early church practiced was simply a continuation of the Jewish faith. In fact, in the beginning, there was seen to be no disconnect between Judaism and between this idea of the way, which is what they called themselves. They simply saw themselves as being the fulfillment of the Messiah, the anointed passages of Judaism and the sacred texts of there. But eventually, ways began to part and they split away from each other. But they took with them so many of the wonderful practices that stoked faith inside of them. I think that's a good thing. Oftentimes, I fear that we put so much emphasis on head knowledge and learning the Bible, and not that that's a bad thing, but we spend a lot less time doing, practicing, disciplining ourselves in other ways that can be helpful. And so that's what we're doing over these next 6 weeks, is looking one a week at 6 different spiritual practices that the ancient church used in addition to the Bible, and actually before they had the Bible. So this was kind of all that they had. So today we're going to find ourselves in Psalm chapter 55, 119, and then 65 as well, to look at what the psalmist, the songwriter, David, what his life looked like. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pull out a few of these verses, and you may not have ever thought them through in this context, but what we're saying is we know that this was a practice of theirs. And so when we know that, when we look at some of these scriptural texts this week, we're able to say, oh, that's what's going on there. It's not just a poetic line, but it's a poetic line that has some foundation in practice. And so Psalm 55:17, morning, noon, and night, I cry out in my distress, and the Lord hears my voice. So cry out in my distress could just mean he's shouting to God that things are not going well in his life at that point, or it could actually mean that he's praying. Of course it means he's praying. Anytime that you shout out to God, anytime the Lord hears your voice, this is another way of saying prayer, whether it is intentionally on your knees, hands together, eyes closed, head bowed, praying to God, whether you're in a posture of prayer and a mindset of prayer, or you're just crying out to God and God's listening to you, there is still that communication that's going on back and forth. And so here we see a time where David is in a posture of prayer that is driven by distress. And those keys, as we talked about yesterday, and as we saw in the rhythms that the church has had for hundreds, thousands of years, morning, noon, and night. Anytime we see specific details, concrete details, that's a red flag. He says noon, morning, and night, likely sunrise, sunset. So there is a rhythm here in David's life of prayer, morning, noon, and night, that during those moments where he already has set aside this season for prayer, maybe it was 5 minutes, maybe it was 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, we don't know, but during those times that he has already set aside, he cries out in his distress and the Lord hears him. So he has this liturgy, this rhythm that's already built in that now is being co-opted by his emotions. And isn't that what happens in prayer? So let's jump over now to 119, verse 62, and then we'll jump immediately down to 164. I rise at midnight to thank you. I will praise you 7 times a day because all of your regulations are just. 119, the longest chapter in the Bible. A lot of content in there. A great chapter if you're just looking for a place to go. Maybe even today, go ahead and read all of Psalm 119. But I want you to see there's some more concrete details. Midnight to thank you 7 times a day because all of your regulations are just. Remember yesterday we talked about in Acts, Paul and Silas, they were up at midnight in the prison singing and rejoicing. Everybody was listening to them. Nobody was going nuts. Why? Because there was this rhythm. Today, you might imagine the Islam call to prayer, where there's a specific time, the broadcast goes out, everybody prays at that time. Do you know where that rhythm came from? That practice came from? It came out of early Christianity and Judaism as well. They were just continuing on a practice that all religious people did in those days. Now, most of us have let go of those rhythms of regular call to prayer, but Muslims still continue on with it. And so Paul and Silas are up at midnight. It's the time for the call to prayer. They're singing and they're rejoicing rather than crying out in distress. And that's surprising to the other prisoners. It wasn't surprising that they were up at midnight praying. It was surprising what the content of their prayers were in Acts. Well, David here is practicing that same rhythm hundreds, several thousand years before Paul and Silas. I rise at midnight to thank you. It's not just randomly getting up in the middle of the night in order, I'm just going to break my sleep time in half in order to thank God. not uber pious in that way. No, he has a regular rhythm of rising at this time in the night. And at this moment, this is what the context of those prayers are. That regular rhythm at midnight is thankfulness. I will praise you 7 times a day because all of your regulations are just. Remember that graphic that I put up at the beginning, that liturgy of midnight prayers, matins, all the way through lauds, sunrise, sunset, vespers, compline, prayer as night falls. How many of them were there? 7. I will praise you 7 times a day. David isn't just being random here. David is saying, I have a rhythm of 7 times a day of intentionally praying to you because your regulations are just. We'll jump here, Psalm 65:8. So that those who dwell at the ends of the earth are in awe at your signs. You make the going out of the morning and the evening to shout for joy. This shout for joy, another way of saying essentially prayer that even the going out of the day and the coming in of the day, that creation itself prays. It shouts for joy. It communicates to God and about God. And so what we're seeing here is all of these things tying together, that creation prays and has a rhythm to it, sunrise and sunset. And this is a reflection of the heart and the mindset of the God, the creator of all. And so we, being a creation from that same creator, should have a rhythm of joy, of thankfulness, of communication in our going outs and in our coming ins, in our sunrises and in our sunsets. Kevin, you may be reading a lot into that. Well, yeah, I may be reading a lot into that, except it's everywhere. It's everywhere in Psalms. It's everywhere in Acts, as we saw. Over the next couple of days, we're going to see other places and other people in Scripture who follow the same rhythms at wildly different times during history. And so all of this together paints a picture that for hundreds and thousands of years in Judaism and in early Christianity, and even some people continuing today, there has been this rhythm consistently of setting aside of time for prayer, intentionally fixing that on your schedule so that reminders of God may be fixed in your heart and in your life. So as we close out today, the real question is, what does your rhythm of prayer look like? Many people do sit on their knees in a posture of prayer, hands folded, head bowed, eyes closed, and that to them is prayer. But for other people, prayer looks like journaling. For other people, prayer looks like meditation. For other people, prayer looks more like a Bible study or devotion. For some people, prayer looks like a pause, a moment of silence, a centering activity or moment. For most people, it looks like all of those things, depending on the needs and the space of the time. And in one of the comments yesterday, the question was, should I set it at a time or times where it will be difficult for me to do? So it's a discipline that is difficult, or should this be the opposite of that? Should this be something that I should wrap around my schedule? And I think, it kind of depends on where you are. But the truth of the matter is, whenever you set something fixed in your schedule, no matter how easy that moment seems and how empty that moment seems, there will come a time where that discipline won't seem as easy in your schedule. But because you've set aside that rhythm and that time, it will be easy for you to work things around it rather than just working your spiritual life in around everything else. And that is why we set regular fixed rhythms of spiritual moments in our life, is so that rather than us being whipped about on the storms and chaos of whatever it is that we are facing in our day, the storms and the chaos and whatever it is that we're facing in our day are whipped around the pillars of the spiritual rhythms in our life, prayer hopefully being one of many. Until tomorrow, happy reading.